Hi, I'm Boris Mance and I will be presenting the preliminary results of traditional media analysis on behalf of University of Ljubljana team. In order to answer the overarching question of what discourse patterns traditional media adopted in their reporting on refugees and migration issues, we firstly examined the dynamics of media coverage and the most prominent peaks within. And secondly, the share of news related to these issues among all the news in a given period. By identifying the most prominent events, we were able to further identify the dimensions that form the basic clusters in national media coverage of the migration issues. In our analysis, we used the data from Event Registry, which is basically a platform for global news monitoring and includes more than 30,000 news sources. Out of more than 11 million articles published in Event Registry in 18 selected countries, during the 6-year period, roughly 2% of all articles met the selection criteria and were contained in the final analysis. First, we were interested in which refugee and migration-related events were covered the most by the media. These are colored in blue. And on the other hand, how much media attention on refugee and migration was published around predefined events, namely the adoptions of both global compacts and European parliamentary elections. These are colored in purple. Time span taken into account was 7 days before and 7 days after the highest peak or the date of the event, while the graph represents the number of articles per day. 5 countries are selected for this presentation: Germany and France as Central EU member countries, countries from the periphery located at the external borders of the EU, Italy and Greece, and US as an important global actor also largely affected by migration. Events of so-called first and second migrant wave to Europe were among the most prominent events in Germany, France, and Italy. In Greece, on the other hand, the events of first migrant wave were not so prominently covered in traditional media compared to the events of the second migrant wave, which culminated in a visit of a special UNHCR envoy to Greece. On the other hand, the most prominent media events in this country dealt with the problems of refugee camps in 2019, but did not receive such prominence in any of the other 4 compared countries, indicating relative blindness of national media of other EU countries for the common problem. Events around first and second migrant wave moderately resonated in US as well. However, the most prominent mediated US events were indigenous. For example, Trump's travel ban on people of Muslim religion and separation of children from their families on US-Mexico border. Contrary to Greece, these events received substantial prominence in the media of other analyzed countries. Likewise, media coverage of issues related to migration was substantially lower during the adoptions of both global compacts as well as during European parliamentary elections. The share of migration-related news within all of published news can serve as indicator of relevance. The largest share of migration-related news was identified in peak 1 in German media, as every 5th article was referring to these issues. Obtained event registry data suggests the smallest share of migration-related news in Greece a week before and after EP elections, indicating relative insignificance of this issue in Greek European parliamentary campaign. When identified entities co-occurring in the same article are visualized as a network, where the links among them correspond to frequencies of their co-occurrence, and the size of the label corresponds to the number of different links which exist between the particular entity and the entities that surround it, we are able to identify subtle structures within the network by applying the clustering algorithm. The reduced network, which is visualized, contains only the most important entities. In case of peak 1 in German media, 3 clusters are the most prominent and correspond to cleavages between national, colored in pink, regional or European, colored in blue, and global, colored in green, frames of news coverage. All of them contain the most important political actors, locations, and organizations, but also concepts, for example, German language, family, Christianity, in the national pink cluster, referring to nativist values, or Euro, indicating the raised issue of costs in migration discourses. Similar clusters appear in French media within the same period. Only in this case, the largest cluster is regional, European, colored in black, national, colored in pink, and global, colored in blue. Interestingly, among these largest clusters in French coverage of the first migration wave, the cluster appears which refers upon the issues of journalism and/or relation to social media. This one is colored in green. This indicates that besides the main cleavages, which correspond to national, regional, and global political cleavages, changing role of journalism in relation to social media is a prominent dimension in framing of issues related to migration. Thank you. In case you have any comments, questions, or are in the need of additional clarifications of the analytical procedure, you are very much welcome to contact me via email.
The Europeanization of the Digital Public Discourse on Migration. Anamaria Dutceac Segesten and
Mike Fire
from Lund University, Sweden. The main research questions that we want to answer in this paper are: is the Twitter discourse about migration Europeanized? If so, what are the dynamics of the Europeanization of the migration discourse? And finally, which actor types participate in the Europeanization of the migration discourse? To dig into the theory section a little bit, we define Europeanization in a very broad sense as the process to which a feature of the domestic, be it an identity, a policy, or a discourse, takes on a European dimension. Using some of the theories of Europeanization that were focusing on policy and transposing that to discourse, we use trends to define Europeanization of public media and communication as a process that enlarges the scope of public discourse beyond the territorial nation state. We distinguish three features of a Europeanized public discourse. Building on Ries's work from 2014, we cover content, actors, and connections as the necessary ingredients. First, a Europeanized public discourse needs to be about a European issue. Then it needs to involve at least some European actors. And finally, it needs to build connections beyond the national. In our context, as we study social media, the challenge is to delimit European, what is the European Union, in a digital universe that is known to have no territorial borders. The solution that we adopt here is to use language clusters as proxies for country affiliation. Thus, we operationalize Europeanization as the interactions among accounts belonging to different language clusters. The application of Europeanization on a migration discourse is appropriate because migration is transnational by definition, as it refers to movement across borders. Migration is a pan-European issue. All EU member states are affected, and the EU develops a common migration and asylum policy. Thus, migration fulfills the first two criteria for being Europeanized. It is salient at the EU level and includes national and European non-national actors. In order to disentangle the way we would answer the second research questions about the dynamics of Europeanization, we also continue to be inspired by the Europeanization of policy and use Bördel's model from 2002. In her work, she obviously works with policy transfer. We are trying to adapt this to discourse, and so we take uploading and define it as the situation in which a user from a non-English language cluster is tweeting in English, transporting a national issue to the supranational arena. Downloading happens when a non-English user is retweeting an English language tweet for their vernacular audience. So this user is taking something from the supranational arena and adapts it into the national audience or towards the national audience. Cross-loading refers to horizontal borrowing between EU member states. Finally, we're interested in actors and their migration orientation. And the reason why we do that is because if only some actors, only embracing some migration positions would drive the buildup of transnational connections on social media, the discourse would be Europeanized only for certain publics, so we need to qualify our results. Following the literature on public spheres, we distinguish between the following actor types: politicians and parties, civil society organizations, businesses, media channels and journalists, and regular citizens. When it comes to defining the orientation towards migration of these actors, we take migration to be a controversial and polarizing issue in Europe, as research by Strömbeck and colleagues already has demonstrated. Specifically on social media, we also know that more extreme views are more present, as Heidenreich also notes. Therefore, we use a binary classification, either positive or negative, towards migration for each actor type. In order to answer these questions, we have collected data through Brandwatch and compounded a Twitter query that collected data about European actors, as you see already on the slide, and combined that with different variations of the concept of immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker, migration, and the like. In order to, again, respond to the research questions, we also use a triangulation of methods. And to simplify a little bit, we assign each user account to one main language. This is something done already by the Twitter API. Then we included English retweets and tweets and their relation to domestic tweets. In order to answer the first two research questions about the presence and the dynamics of Europeanization, we built a content user network within and beyond the main language, with edges being constituted by responding or retweeting the same original tweet. And in order to answer the third research questions, we use a qualitative annotation of actor types and their respective orientation towards migration for the most influential users.
What you see here is an overview of our data. So we have 8 different languages within our data set, that being everything from Spanish, French to Polish and Danish. And you can see that Spanish was the language with the most users, and those users have been tweeting and retweeting in Spanish, but also in English. So you can see that English tweeting and retweeting is happening across all the languages in our data set. To answer research question number 1, that is there Europeanization at all? We show 2 graphs. On the left side, labeled uploading, you can see that Dutch users, when not tweeting within their own language, are primarily tweeting in English. This constitutes uploading. On the other side, you see downloading, that is users from a language cluster that are tweeting or retweeting something within a language that is not their own. So here you can see that Dutch users primarily retweet, that is download, content that is English. And at the same time you see that cross-loading, that is tweeting or retweeting content in a language that is not your own, is hardly happening between languages. Moving on to research question number 2, that is what are the dynamics of Europeanization? We can see that English tweeting is happening across different languages. Here you see 2 graphs. On the x-axis you see the time, the years, 2014 to 19, and on the y-axis you see the percentage of tweets or retweets that were tweeted or retweeted in English. And you can see that Dutch is the language that is tweeting and retweeting most in English, but you can also see that all language clusters are more or less simultaneously moving towards tweeting and retweeting more in English. In other words, we see a common time trend in Europeanizing through English. With respect to research question number 3, that is, what are the actor types that are Europeanizing, we show here an overview of the most retweeted English-speaking accounts. What you can see is the median rank within each language cluster, and you can see that those that were on average the most popular within our data were also most popular within each language cluster. In other words, we see a common pattern of retweeting English content across different language clusters. You can also see the role and the loading, that is their stance towards migration. And you can see that the ones that are most negative are common media outlets, that is alternative media outlets, while those that are positive often come from civil society. Moving to the last graph in this presentation, here we go into more detail on the actor types and who is doing Europeanization. What we see here is a network of users. On the left side, you see the network of users that are the most influential within their own language cluster. And we show colors. The colors denote the language cluster that a user is belonging to. And we also show the views that users had with respect to migration, where squares are showing users with negative views and triangles and circles are showing those with positive views. So what you see in the left graph is that users are primarily connected with other users that speak the same language. We see very few connections across language boundaries, and we can also see that European institutional accounts, denoted as stars, are only connected with users that have positive or neutral views and are also on the periphery of the network. Let's move on to the right graph. Here we see users that are tweeting in English or retweeting English content but are not main English speakers. These are the most influential users within each language sphere, and here we see that users are no longer connected primarily with users that speak the same language, but we see two clusters emerging, where one cluster is positive and neutral, and where the other cluster is primarily containing users that have negative views. We also see that European institutions are only connected with a cluster that has positive to neutral views. In other words, who is Europeanizing? Well, users from all countries, but they are primarily connecting with users that have the same views as themselves.
What are the main takeaways of our research? To answer the first research question, is the migration discourse on Twitter in this period Europeanized? The answer is yes. The digital public discourse on this topic connects users beyond the vernacular language clusters. Research question 2 asked, what are the dynamics of Europeanization? And then we can answer that downloading is the most effective. Many English language accounts are widely spread. Uploading is less effective. Non-English accounts do send messages into the English Twitter sphere, but they are not further spread by English language actors. Cross-loading is infrequent. Few users tweet or retweet messages in other languages than their own and other than English. To answer research question 3, which actor types participate in the Europeanization of the migration discourse, we have a relatively complex answer. Most actors are diverse across language clusters. Typically, politicians, citizens, media, and civil society in this order are those most active national accounts. Most downloaded accounts, as you have seen in a previous graph, are alternative media, civil society, citizens, and lastly, political accounts. Most accounts who actually do the downloading, the retweeting in English, belong to ordinary citizens. Thus, the migration discourse can be seen as varying by language cluster, but in many cases there is a dominance of anti-migration actors. And the downloaded discourse in English is generated mostly by anti-migration actors.